Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and as I progress with the Battle of the Wilderness, I'm now moving away from the Saunders Field sector and depicting the fight for the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road between the corps of A.P. Hill and the corps of Winfield Scott Hancock. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Corps Commander A.P. Hill, and Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart sat on their horses at the Widow Tap Farm and discussed the developing engagement. With Richard S. Ewell being heavily engaged on the Confederate left, Lee knew that if his troops could get a hold of the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, he could swing around and be in the rear of Ulysses S. Grant's army, forcing him to either turn his attention away from the Orange Turnpike or to retreat. Grant and George Meade sent the division of George Getty to that location to safeguard their flank and ordered Winfield Scott Hancock to hurry to that location to support Getty. Getty knew he needed a little more time before Hancock's corps would be ready to make their attack, so he attempted to delay Hill's corps. Getty assembled the three brigades he had immediately on hand, those under Frank Wheaton, Lewis Grant, and Henry Eustis, and sent them forward through the thick vegetation of the wilderness. South of the Orange Plank Road, Grant reported little to no resistance. Very few Confederate troops were south of the road, at least initially. North of the road, Cook and Stone's Confederate brigades threw out a strong skirmish line, but it was significantly lacking south of their position. Grant's troops, particularly the 3rd Vermont, were spread out before the harsh terrain. Confederate General Henry Heath recognized the lack of troops on his right and moved the brigade of Henry Walker, containing Tennesseans, Virginians, and Alabamians, to that sector. Walker's men did more than take up a position on Cook's right. They charged the men from Vermont, driving them back. As with many units in this battle, the approaches of the enemy were concealed, and the sudden appearance of such a large group of Confederates caused confusion in the ranks. After they drove Grant back, Walker formed his men on the right of Cook's line. They instantly began to dig in and throw up breastworks, anticipating a counterattack. As Grant's brigade was thrown back, the other two Union brigades stood 50 yards from their Confederate counterparts and fired volleys. One officer recalled, "The men aimed at the wall of fire and smoke in our front. The distance between the two lines was so short that under ordinary conditions we could have charged upon the enemy with the bayonet before given time to reload. But a bayonet charge under these conditions was nearly impossible. A line could advance only slowly and with great difficulty even when unopposed. Anything like a dash upon the enemy was simply out of the question. Many of Getty's men were laying down to load and fire at the rebels. To stand up courted death. As ammunition became depleted, Wheaton replaced his front line with his second line, but despite the added fresh troops and full cartridge boxes, the Confederates weren't budging from their position. On the Union right, Eustis's 2nd Rhode Island crumbled under the weight of the enemy flanking fire. It retreated and began to reform behind the lines. Eustis now moved the 7th and 37th Massachusetts into the front lines. This new batch of soldiers laid down on the ground and kept up a steady fire, hoping that reinforcements would be coming soon. Union gunners brought up a section of artillery and unlimbered it on the road. They threw canister, solid shot, and case shot into the rebel lines. Quickly, a single Confederate gun approached the rebel line on the same road, but from the opposite direction. Each artillery crew began to fire canister at one another, causing death and destruction to the crews and horses. Many of the Union horses were killed in the duel, but they drove off the rebel gun. After the artillery duel ended, a stalemate emerged as neither side was given in. Brigadier General John R. Cook's brigade attempted to gain an advantage and advanced against Wheaton's troops. The rebels captured the guns sitting on the Orange Plank Road, but after a momentary success, the Federal regiments quickly recaptured the guns and the stalemate resumed. Hancock got word from Meade that he wanted the 2nd Corps to reinforce both of Getty's flanks and keep the rest of the corps in reserve. The developing engagement challenged Hancock's ability to follow orders, but he would endeavor to support Getty the way Meade had intended. First, he sent part of John Hobart Ward's brigade to the left of Grant's line. Grant, a capable brigade commander, asked the commander of the 5th Vermont if he could take the Confederate position in his front, since it appeared weak. The commander of the 5th thought for a moment and said, "I think we can." He then asked the two regiments from Ward's brigade, the 20th Indiana and 40th New York, if they would join. They all declared that they would take the position. The three regiments charged and hit Walker's line, caving in part of it and capturing the flag of the 55th Virginia. However, the Federal regiments got pushed back by the rest of Walker's regiments. Because of the Confederate line overlapping Getty's entire line, he needed additional support on the right. The engagement that started between the divisions of Henry Heath and George Getty was now gathering more troops toward the intersection. Hancock ordered the brigades of Alexander Hayes, Robert McAllister, and William Brewster to prepare to advance. Two of Hancock's divisions were forming for an attack. Likewise, Heath extended his line to the right with the 11th North Carolina from William Kirkland's brigade. Two Union brigades on the Confederate right were now poised to slam into Heath's line at a near perpendicular angle. What happened next has never fully been explained or understood by the participants or historians. Mott's division rushed forward, stamping over and through the dense underbrush, and made contact with Heath's line. However, as determined as they marched, the battle line gave way in a domino effect once they hit the Confederate battle line. One officer believed that since a large portion of the soldiers' enlistments were up in a month, many didn't want to die so close to getting out of the army. Some of the men claimed that Confederate forces were hitting their flank and rear, so that could mean that part of the 11th North Carolina had been dispatched to hit the flank, but it couldn't have been a huge amount of men. Either way, the brigades retreated across the Brock Road, securing themselves behind the hastily thrown together breastworks that they had completed before being ordered into the fight. However, the rest of Ward's brigade and Hayes's brigade were approaching Heath's line. The 1st U.S. sharpshooters, also known as Berdan's sharpshooters, were the skirmish line for Hayes' brigade. As they and Ward approached the Confederate line, a destructive volley rang out from the rebel breastworks. One New Yorker remembered, "The woods light up with the flashes of musketry as if with lightning, while the incessant roar of the volleys sound like the crashing of thunderbolts." A member of the 3rd Michigan recalled, "The slaughter is fearful, men fall on every side, and my flag is receiving its share of bullets. Charge after charge is made by each side. Sometimes we drive the enemy, and then they rally and drive us, until both sides are exhausted, and night puts an end to our first day's struggle." Another soldier commented, "Brave men are falling like autumn leaves, and death holds high carnival in our ranks." Members of the 63rd Pennsylvania were laying down, obviously shaken by the horrific engagement. Hayes rode over to his old regiment to give them encouragement when a bullet struck his temple. His troops would carry him behind the lines in a blanket, and he would die a few hours later. His brigade would be taken over by John Crocker. Ward's men swung to attack Walker's men south of the Orange Plank Road and bolstered Grant's tired but tenacious troops. Heath would now commit the rest of Kirkland's brigade, sending them to various points in his line that he deemed weak, or to replace regiments who were out of ammunition. The one division under Heath had battled against elements of 3 different divisions and were holding on and even launching counterattacks. Part of Wheaton's brigade was forced to fall back for lack of ammunition, so the battle line that Hancock came to support needed to be patched. Hancock ordered John Gibbon to bring his division up at the double quick and ready them for an advance. Hancock was having to feed his men in piecemeal, but that's all he could do. If he hadn't, the Confederates could have overwhelmed Getty early in the engagement. He couldn't wait until all of his men were up before attacking. With the situation becoming critical for Heath's men, Hill and Lee dispatched 2 brigades from Cadmus Wilcox's division to Heath's front. Before they left, at the Tuning Farm, the brigades of Samuel McGowan and Alfred Scales were led in prayer by the chaplains. One soldier remembered, "On the left thundered the dull battle. On the right the sharp crack of rifles gradually swelled to equal importance. Above was the blue, placid heavens. Around us a varied landscape of forest and fields, green with the earliest foliage of spring, and here knelt hirsute and brown veterans striving for another struggle with death." The movement of Wilcox's men was discovered by the Union signal station, and Meade and Grant sent orders for Wadsworth's division to attack the Confederate left on the north side of the Orange Plank Road. Back in that sector, Grant and Wheaton's brigade had fired some of their last shots and needed rest and refitted. Hancock formed Samuel Carroll and Joshua Owens' brigades on either side of the Plank Road so they could replace the 2 tired brigades on the front line. As Grant pulled his right 2 regiments back so they could be replaced, Walker's Virginians charged their position, and Grant fell back. At this same time, the brigades of Scales and McGowan were ready to replace the weary troops of Heath. When Carroll and Owen attacked, so did Scales and McGowan, with the fresh rebel brigades advancing over the breastworks of Heath's men. Cook and Kirkland retreated to regroup and get resupplied with ammunition. Both sides battled in this lush terrain until the Confederates settled back into the breastworks prepared by their comrades. Stone on the left of Heath's line hadn't been relieved yet, but it needed to be soon. Many of his men fixed bayonets because they had no ammunition. Many of the Mississippians hoped that it wouldn't come to defending themselves with the bayonet, but they were prepared to do so if ordered. Luckily for them, Edward Thomas's Georgians would replace the beleaguered brigade. Hancock was a little cautious in the wilderness because he couldn't see the enemy's line or know its strength. Plus, it was difficult to attack the flanks because of the dense underbrush and swampy terrain. Nevertheless, he was attempting to overlap the enemy's flanks. A.P. Hill informed James Lane, whose North Carolinians were about to take up a position on the Confederate right, that Scales's men had become too disorganized in the attack and needed to fall back to reform, so Lane was to take their spot. Lane did as he was told. His men attacked the approaching two brigades under Nelson Miles and Thomas Smith. As he engaged with the approaching Federals, Wilcox pulled McGowan away from the front line to reform in the rear. This exposed Lane's brigade to flanking fire. Add on to that, John R. Brooks' brigade to the south had sent the 64th and 66th New York north to attack the Confederate flank. Lane was now by himself and surrounded by Union brigades. The only thing that saved Lane's men was the fact that they had thrown up some stiff resistance, and darkness began to cover the battlefield. In the darkness, Wadsworth's division approached from the north. Hill only had one unit available to combat this division, the 5th Alabama Battalion. Hill ordered the Alabamians to advance, screaming at the top of their lungs. When they did, the darkness and the sounds of shrieking rebel yells coming from that darkness halted Wadsworth's division. He had already been bloodied at Hickerson's Field, and the men stopped in their tracks. An historian of the battle summarized the fight on Hill's front on May 5th succinctly when he wrote, A.P. Hill's battle farther south, however, was one of the war's most brilliant defensive efforts. There, the 7,000 men of Heath's division fought to a standstill a similarly sized 6th Corps division, Getty, followed by one assault after another from General Hancock's 2nd Corps, altogether some 30,000 men. Darkness covered the battlefield and gave the soldiers a few hours of respite after a horrific day of fighting. However, the Army commanders were planning for the next day's actions.